We assume we know what racial profiling is, but let's briefly talk about it, and at least just to define it, so we all know as we talk about it, we're on the same page. How would you define it?
I'd like to hear from Professor Banks.
I guess I'll start then.
We all kind of think we know what it is.
Yes, exactly.
No, I think that is true. I mean, this is one of those topics that where everyone has a sense of what racial profiling is, and typically we think of it as being what we're opposed to. But in fact, it's really hard to define in a rigorous fashion. But we could start with the idea that racial profiling entails law enforcement officers selecting an individual to investigate based on racial stereotypes about the individual's racial group. So general racial stereotype might be that members of this particular group are drug dealers. So you stop people of that group when you're investigating drug crime, but you don't stop people from other groups when you're investigating drug crime. So everyone would agree that that counts as racial profiling. The problem is, where do you define the boundaries? And if any of this is unclear, we can have discussion. The problem is, where do you define the boundaries of racial profiling? Because at the other extreme, everyone would agree that it's okay to take account of race in some circumstances. So although we all think that we should prohibit racial profiling categorically, we don't think that we should prohibit law enforcement officers from taking account of race.
Okay, now let's get into that. Some would say that racial profiling is an important tool in a police department's arsenal. So, what would be wrong with that?
I think it's how you define racial profiling, and what we're talking about is an illegal act that the United States Department of Justice calls any police-initiated action that relies on the race, ethnicity, or national origin rather than the behavior of an individual or information that leads the police to a particular individual who has been identified as being or having been engaged in criminal activity. That's a very narrow definition. And if I was I've covered the police department in Palo Alto. I've known every chief since the mid-1960s. Actually, chief was back chief in the 50s, so I've known for half a century, and most of their command staff, top command staff people. And I will say categorically that back in the 60s, late 60s, there were officers who had very strong racial feelings, of negative racist feelings. And when the new chief, Jim Zerker, came aboard in 1972, the way he dealt with that was he put most of the hard head officers on midnight to 8 a.m. shift, and they migrated out of the department. And at that point, I told some black friends of mine from East Palo Alto, I said, don't come into Palo Alto after midnight. They put all the hard case officers on the midnight shift. And I thought it was a brilliant move by Chief Zerker. And he then initiated recruitment of women, recruitment of minorities, and there was amazing change in that department within a 10-year period.
Well, it's interesting that while there was amazing change then, some people are saying that there needs to be more changes now. And I think, Pat, you had said during the last city council meeting that racial profiling and catching criminals are, did you say they do not necessarily go together?
That's correct. We've known what good policing practices are, and there's a whole variety of things that our police force can do and has done when we look for criminals. And it's good police work. It's preventing crimes and making the public aware of participating in that, investigating crimes. And that's quite different from a very broad stroke based upon race, and anyone who might resemble, in the broadest sense, in our case, 3 different suspects out of the group of suspects that from some assaults, 3 were African American. And if they had 3 different appearances of 3 different suspects, then we get into a real dilemma of how broadly have we now said that African American males, any adult, or almost any adult, would fall into that description. And if that's the case, then our net is, in my mind, far too broad. And we end up using our resources in misguided ways instead of really going after and preventing crime and tracking down criminals. We're instead spending valuable police resources in a misguided way as well, in addition to it being wrong.